Hello everybody, this is Dr. Willow Ariella coming to you to talk to you about qualitative research. I think sometimes qualitative research is a little bit challenging to describe, but for me, the best way that I have to explain it to people is to say that qualitative research is more or less about words. You're asking people to think about things and describe things and talk about things, and then you analyze their words for a variety of things, and there are a variety of ways to analyze people's words. So basically, qualitative research is looking at words, at meaning, symbology, how people do their lives and why they do their lives. So you're looking for things really other than numbers. However, sometimes qualitative research is kind of crunched down into numbers, more like categories than so much numbers. So you're looking at people's lives, and a lot of it is looking at looking at their words and how they describe things and think about things and why. So in this chapter, the authors are talking about qualitative research methods, and some of the things that I wanted to highlight on the first page of chapter 3, they describe that there was a heavy emphasis on conducting experiments in psychology because the founders wanted it to be considered a science, but people, started asking different kinds of questions, and they didn't fit the experimental method so well. And so different people in different fields, not just psychology, but more like anthropology and, anthropology, and some other fields. I'm blanking on them right now. So other fields kind of borrowed from some anthropological methods of studying people in their natural environment. So in qualitative research, sometimes you study people in the natural environment, but oftentimes it's not. But again, we're more looking at how they do things and wherever that environment is and why they do them and what they think about them. And so some non-experimental methods have been developed over the many decades. And there's been a debate for quite a while. I think it's probably more or less resolved at this point, but for quite a while, people who were and are big fans of the experimental method and didn't really understand qualitative methodology, really thought that anything that was non-experimental was less than, inferior to, did not tell us good information like experimental methods did. So there was a strong bias against qualitative methodology for quite a while, and you can understand why when you understand that psychologists wanted psychology to be a science, and so the experimental methods have been the underpinnings are the underpinnings of psychology. But if you do qualitative research well, then it can provide you and others with some good solid data that can be usable. And so they make a point that the choice of a non-experimental research strategy depends on the type of problem being investigated, where, and the nature. This is always the case for any methodology that you choose. The research question or the research problem is going to drive it. So people ask, well, what method should you choose for X, or why do they choose that method, or whatever. Your research question always drives the research methodology. And sometimes it's really clear what it should be, and sometimes not so clear. But it's not usually done the other way around. It's not usually, well, I'm going to choose this method, and then I'm going to choose my research question, It's usually done the other way, although some people have a strong preference for a particular method, so they formulate their research questions around that. But generally speaking, the research question drives the methodology as well as everything else in that experiment. So, so qualitative research methods took a while for these to be accepted, and I'm sure there are still some in different fields who don't think it's a valid or reliable method, but definitely becoming more and more acceptable for qualitative research. On page 50, there's a description of the characteristics of qualitative research. So there are 5 points. Number 3, wanted to highlight, reports with words as opposed to statistical processes. So that's generally the case. Focusing on words. Understanding human meanings is a big part of qualitative studies. And number 5 says it's conducted in a natural setting. I wouldn't say this is always the case. I mean, in my research with sheltered battered women, I interviewed them at battered women's shelters. I wouldn't say that that's their natural setting, but you can talk about a natural setting in a couple of different ways, probably more, but a couple. One would be, you know, where humans are found naturally, which is anywhere really. But I would think most of us would think, you know, women, their natural setting is kind of home, maybe work, but generally home. So, you know, is a shelter a natural setting? Well, it was at the time that they were interviewed. So, you know, you can look at it different ways, but so, you know, oftentimes they're done in natural settings, but not always. And so they asked a question at the bottom of page 50, and then they answered it, that the qualitative research report will generally contain less scientific terminology. Well, not always. I've read many qualitative studies that are full of jargon and were very difficult for me to read. But it doesn't contain like necessarily well, it doesn't contain, you know, Erlenmeyer flasks and things like that, but there is a lot of jargon that's used in scientific reports. But anyway, so, you know, the focus is more on words than on statistics and significance. And under data analysis, how do researchers evaluate the quality of their qualitative results? And this is a very important and still a debated question. I don't think this has been resolved. I think qualitative research methodology is still being refined. They mention Guba and Lincoln. I think that's how you say Guba. Don't know for sure. Guba and Lincoln's 1994 book. That's a very well-known and I think well-respected qualitative kind of Bible, so to speak, on qualitative research. People use a lot. But you can see it was written in 1994. I'm guessing that there have been other books on qualitative methodology since then, but we studied that in my doctoral program, or I did. So they say that there are primarily 3 or 4 criteria, mainly 3, the first 3, that are used. They're called triangulation. If you have confirmability, dependability, and credibility, and can triangulate those 3, you know, you have a triangle of confirmability at the top, dependability on the side, and credibility on the side, and you can see a link between those 3, or, you know, you have a strong triangle of those 3, then people who, you know, would read a qualitative study would look for these criteria, generally speaking, and that's how they would deem it a good study or not a good study. Confirmability is about trying to remove researcher bias. I can tell you from personal experience, it's still very tricky to remove our bias from any kind of study, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. It's still tricky. I could feel myself when I was analyzing the women's interviews, feel myself kind of wanting to, label things in a certain way or whatever that is, so I had to be really careful. We have to be really careful when we're analyzing other people's information. I don't know a good way around that, except when people do review your reports and you quote your participants, which you should do in your reports, that other people can draw conclusions and they can test their conclusions against yours. On page 52, how would you determine if something is credible? One way to do that is that you have participants or informants read and judge its credibility. In my dissertation work, I did have focus groups or participants, women who were not part of the original study. I did share with them my results and ask them their feedback. And so that is one way to have somebody judge the credibility and the results of what conclusions that you're making, is to have other people check it, especially people who are in the same situation, and then get their feedback. And then they mention transferability or generalizability. How well can you draw conclusions to other populations from the participants in the sample that you utilized during your research. It's relevant in some studies, not relevant in others. When you're doing case studies, case studies are designed to focus on one particular individual or very, very few individuals, and so you're not trying to make generalized statements, although occasionally you can, see that there is similarity, but, so some research is designed to be more generalizable than others. Selected examples of qualitative research methods. So they discuss a few. Again, naturalistic observation, when you're studying in a natural setting. A very common one is, observing preschoolers. So they're in their, generally natural setting. They're there in preschool or in school, however many hours a day. So it's a pretty natural setting for them. So you want to see how kids interact, or whatever your focus is. Ethnographic inquiry. So you want to learn about a culture or group in a culture. This is a traditionally anthropological format. Anthropologists sort of perfected ethnographic inquiry. I think my research was somewhere between naturalistic observation and ethnographic inquiry. I was learning about a certain group or culture, battered women, so using a mixture. And then you can be a participant who observes or not. So there are different ways to do ethnographic inquiry. So some people will immerse themselves and be part of a group, and others don't. And there are reasons for being a participant observer and reasons not. Oh gosh, I have a note here. Let's see. Says as a researcher, you become immersed in this culture for a long period of time and gather data through participant observation and interviewing. Sometimes people think that when you are doing this kind of study that you're just going in there and just writing down everything. Researchers would go crazy if they did that. So researchers generally tend, again, to have a particular research question, and they wouldn't just choose questions out of the thin air to ask people. They generally have a focus. So in my interviews with women, I came up with interview questions based on my literature review. So, you know, even though they were open-ended questions, and there are a lot of them, and I could follow up with some of them, you know, and ask some questions that weren't specifically listed, they were planned. So generally, that's what researchers need to do. You need to have a plan and implement that plan. Otherwise, you could get way off track. And sometimes that's good, and people can do that. But generally speaking, people have a plan and they have specific questions in mind. And again, in the box on page 53, the participant as observer has its drawbacks and weaknesses. That's for sure. That's true with every research method. Time, finances, acceptance, and objectivity may pose severe problems for participant-observer research. Very true. It is true. So something that people have to keep in mind. They mentioned focus groups. Like I said, I use focus groups in my study to have them tell me if I was on the right track, basically, with my results. Case studies, I mentioned those already, but generally speaking, case studies, you're looking at analyzing one person, maybe two or three in the same kind of category, but generally you can't generalize beyond your case studies, and you can't establish cause and effect relationships. But that's not usually the point of case studies anyway. And then people generally take a case study and they come up with research questions that they go broader on those and do a much larger study. That can happen. Doesn't always, but it can. They talk about grounded theory. Strauss and Corbin, again, really big names in the qualitative research field. Their grounded theory approach. I can tell you that I had difficulty figuring out what they were talking about when I was in grad school, but they have some suggestions about how to go about creating theory in using qualitative research. But I don't think, no, this is just my opinion, mind you, but I don't think their perspective has any greater something than just qualitative research in general. I mean, that's what we do. We talked about, or I talked about in an earlier video, in deductive and inductive logic, and you can do that with a grounded theory approach, or you can do that with experimental methods. So, you know, I'm not sure. You investigate it a little bit more if you're interested in grounded theory and see what you think. But anyway, I say the ultimate goal is to derive theories that are grounded in reality. So what does that mean? How is that different from an experimental method? I'm not really sure. They have some methods of dealing with the data, dealing with your interviews or you know, observations. So they call them different kinds of coding. And again, I had difficulty with their coding definitions when I was in grad school, so I found them a little bit challenging to follow. So I sort of used what I understood about their information on coding with other qualitative information, and sort of developed a little bit of my own process, which for me was more like categorization. So it was more like open coding, probably. So I think their coding stuff is interesting, but I'm not sure that I really got how you specifically apply things like axial coding or selective coding when I was doing my qualitative analysis. So it'd be interesting to learn from someone who I think might have a better idea of how you actually apply those. And I think it takes practice too, and looking at other people's notes and how they did their coding. And at the time, that just wasn't my focus. And then they talk about participatory action research. I think, in my understanding of people who have done PAR, that it tends to be a very long and complex process. It can take years. Of course, some experimental studies that are longitudinal or whatever, they can take years as well, but PAR is pretty much like participant observation, but people who participate and who use the PAR tend to be social activists and want to make changes as well. So qualitative studies are very informative if they're done well. I think the main points when you're analyzing qualitative information would be the 3 criteria on page 51: confirmability, dependability, and credibility. And having others review your information before you publish it, I think is very helpful. So that ends my review of Chapter 3. Thank you for your time and attention. Aloha.